If you've been told your nighttime bathroom trips are simply about your prostate, or simply about your age, and there's nothing more worth investigating, that's not actually the whole story. In 20 years of appointments, not one doctor ever asked me what I ate for dinner. I'm 83, and no doctor ever told me why I kept waking up to pee, not in 20 years of appointments. In the next few minutes, I'll tell you exactly what I found instead, and it has nothing to do with my prostate directly. These days I sleep through most nights, and I've stopped doing that grim mental math in the dark, wondering how much worse things might get. I hosted a dinner party last month, staying up late with old friends, and I wasn't distracted the entire evening by counting down to my next trip down the hallway. I'm not telling you that to brag. I'm telling you because I spent 20 years assuming this was purely about my prostate, when part of it was sitting on my dinner plate the whole time. Decades of checkups. Decades of blood pressure checks, the same questions asked every single year, the same 15 minutes divided between a dozen topics. Not once in all that time did anyone connect my nighttime bathroom trips to anything on my dinner plate. I assumed, the way most of us do, that this was purely a plumbing problem, prostate, bladder, something mechanical and specific to that part of the body. I never once thought to look at what I was actually eating each evening, because nobody had ever suggested there might be a connection worth investigating. It's a strange blind spot, looking back, given how carefully I tracked everything else about my diet for the sake of my blood pressure and cholesterol. I carried this pattern for years, up once, sometimes twice, most nights. I made the usual excuses to myself. It's just age, it's just what happens, there's nothing to be done. I remember doing rough math some nights, lying there in the dark, wondering whether this was already as bad as it would get, or whether there was worse still coming. That kind of quiet mental arithmetic never leads anywhere good. It's built entirely on the assumption that decline only accelerates, never levels off, never partially reverses, and I ran that grim calculation more nights than I want to admit, without ever once questioning the assumption underneath it. Looking back, I think that arithmetic was its own quiet form of self-punishment, a way of bracing for the worst so it couldn't catch me off guard. It never once occurred to me that the premise itself might be wrong, that the line I kept extending forward in the dark wasn't actually fixed on the trajectory I assumed. My wife noticed the pattern before I ever named it out loud. She'd hear me get up, wait until I settled back into bed, and neither of us would say anything about it the next morning. It became one of those unspoken facts of our marriage, acknowledged only through silence, the way certain routines get folded into a life together without ever being discussed directly. Here's what I eventually learned, entirely by accident, reading something that had nothing to do with my prostate at all. Higher daily salt intake is independently associated with increased nighttime urination and daytime frequency, separate from anything happening with prostate size. The mechanism involves how your kidneys handle sodium. Excess salt increases the volume of urine your body needs to produce overnight to process it, essentially manufacturing extra nighttime trips that have nothing to do with your bladder failing and everything to do with what arrived on your dinner plate hours earlier. That misplaced assumption is exactly what reframed everything for me. Your kidneys process sodium in a way that directly affects how much urine your body produces. And that process doesn't pause just because you've fallen asleep. Researchers who study this treat dietary sodium as a genuinely modifiable, measurable factor in nighttime urination. Not a footnote, a real lever. For 11 years, the bathroom ran my nights. Up at midnight, up at 2, up again at 5, a weak little stream each time and never quite empty. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, knowing I'd drag through the next day half awake. I thought it was just age. It wasn't. Here's what no one ever sat me down to explain. The prostate crowds the channel your urine runs through, so the bladder never fully drains. It just fills right back up within the hour. That's why you go and go again. It was never weakness. It was never getting old. And the pills they kept handing me, they left me dizzy every time I stood, gave me that strange, dry finish where almost nothing came, and the nights never changed. But there is a gentle way to help that bladder empty the way it's meant to, without any of that. At 83, I finally sleep through the night again. I'll show you exactly what in this video, and if you want the simple support I personally use, there's a free presentation linked in the description below. So here's what I actually changed. I started paying real attention to sodium, not just the obvious salt shaker on the table, but the hidden amounts in processed food, canned soup, deli meat, restaurant meals, the places salt hides that most of us never think to check. There's a real cross-sectional study out of Japan involving over 700 patients that found daily salt intake was an independent risk factor for both daytime frequency and nighttime urination after controlling for other factors. A follow-up intervention study took that further. Patients who actually reduced their salt intake saw a measurable improvement in nocturia, with the average number of nighttime episodes dropping in the reduction group over the course of the study.
I want to be precise about what this means and doesn't mean. This isn't about eliminating salt entirely, which isn't healthy or necessary. It's about noticing where the hidden excess actually comes from and trimming it, particularly in the evening meal specifically, since that's the sodium your body is still processing when you're trying to sleep. This is a real physiological lever, not a vague wellness suggestion, measurable in the actual studies, not just plausible-sounding advice. I started reading labels I'd never bothered reading before, genuinely surprised at how much sodium was hiding in foods I'd never have suspected. Bread, cereal, things that don't even taste salty. I moved my saltiest meal of the day to earlier, lunch instead of dinner, giving my body more daylight hours to process it before bedtime. The bread was the real surprise. I'd never once thought of a slice of ordinary sandwich bread as a salty food, and finding out how much sodium was quietly built into something so plain changed how I looked at my entire pantry, not just the obviously salty snacks I'd already been suspicious of. I started making a habit of reading labels out loud to my wife at the grocery store, half as a joke at first, and then more seriously once we both realized how many of our regular purchases were quietly loaded with sodium we'd never thought to question. It became something we did together, comparing brands, a small shared project that had nothing to do with either of us, and everything to do with both of us paying closer attention. I added a few other pieces around it, since no single change carries all the weight. Less caffeine and alcohol in the evening, since both compound the same problem from a different angle. A short walk most mornings, supporting overall circulation and kidney function. Elevating my legs for 20 minutes in the late afternoon, since fluid pooled in the legs during the day also redistributes into nighttime urine, a separate but related mechanism working alongside the sodium piece. None of these pieces would have mattered as much in isolation. It was the combination, sustained for about 6 weeks, that actually shifted my nights, matching roughly the timeline described in the actual intervention study, which measured its results after a comparable period of sustained change. I want to be honest that reading nutrition labels felt tedious at first, almost like a chore added on to an already full day. But it became automatic within a couple of weeks, the same way any new habit eventually stops requiring conscious effort and just becomes part of how you shop and cook. My wife and I took a 2-week trip to visit family out of state last spring, eating out most nights, something that used to guarantee a rough stretch of sleep in unfamiliar beds. This time, I paid attention to what I ordered, and I slept through nearly every night of that trip. I think about a man named Melvin who wrote in, 68, who told me he'd never once connected his own nighttime symptoms to his diet, assuming it was purely a prostate issue like everyone always told him. He said the moment it clicked for him was realizing how much sodium was in his favorite frozen dinners, foods he'd eaten several nights a week for years without ever checking the label closely. Melvin told me he'd actually gone back through a week's worth of meals after learning this, adding up the sodium honestly for the first time, and being genuinely startled at the total. He said the counting itself, more than any single meal change, was what finally made the invisible problem visible enough to actually address. He also mentioned something that stuck with me, that his own wife had started doing the same grocery store label reading my wife and I had turned into a habit, entirely independently, before either of us had ever compared notes. It made me think there's probably a whole generation of couples quietly running the same experiment in parallel, none of them realizing how common it actually is. If you're on medication for your blood pressure, your heart, or a diuretic specifically, please hear this clearly. Nothing here replaces your treatment, and you should never stop or change a medication on your own. Sodium intake can interact directly with blood pressure management, so mention any dietary change to your doctor, especially if you're already being monitored for hypertension. What I want you to walk away with is this. Not every nighttime trip to the bathroom starts with your prostate. Sometimes it starts hours earlier, on your dinner plate, in a form so ordinary nobody thinks to question it.
hiding in plain sight behind a label most of us have never once actually read.
I think about all those years assuming this was purely mechanical, purely about aging tissue, when part of the actual cause was something I could have changed at any dinner table, any night, the entire time. 20 years of frozen dinners and canned soup, never once questioned, quietly working against the sleep I was so desperate to get back. So here's what I use, a few drops every single morning. And let me be honest about why it works. One herb on its own nudges one thing, but your prostate answers best when several signals are calmed at the same time. The flow, the emptying, the pressure behind it. That's why what I take brings them together, concentrated, working as one, not a single ingredient hoping to do everything. Stronger stream, full emptying, quiet nights, your freedom back. And none of the trade-offs, no dizziness, no dry finish, nothing taken from you as a man. It's linked right under this video. Go see it for yourself. It won't replace good sleep or your own doctor. It's there to support your body. At 83, I sleep through. It is not too late for you. I think about the man I was, doing grim math in the dark about how much worse his nights might get. And I think about the man I am now, who sleeps through most of them and barely thinks about it. That's not vanity. That's dignity. Being the man who found the actual cause instead of the man who just endured the symptom. If you've ever assumed a nighttime symptom was purely mechanical without ever checking your diet or reading a single label, tell me in the comments. And if this kind of honest, specific explanation is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. There's more of this ahead every single week, and I genuinely read every comment myself, label reading habits and all.